Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Marnie. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you for coming. I would like to thank the UN Correspondents Association for hosting this press conference at this very important time for journalists. The groups here, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Reporters Without Borders, who could not be here to attend the press conference, but they too have been very active on this case, and I would urge you to go to their website and to solicit information from them too. This is an unprecedented time for global journalism. We have witnessed the disappearance and, according to Turkish journalists, the butchering of a prominent US resident Washington Post columnist in a Saudi diplomatic mission in Turkey. This sends an incredibly chilling signal to journalists around the world that their lives don't matter and that states can have you murdered with impunity. And that's why we are here this morning, to make sure that there is no impunity in this case. We believe that the only way to ensure that there is no whitewash in the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi is that the United Nations take on an independent, transparent, and international investigation. We believe that Turkey should contact the UN Secretary General and instigate such an investigation. It is, we think, the only credible way to get to the bottom of this and to make sure that those who are responsible for the disappearance of our colleague are held to account and brought to justice. I'd like now to ask my colleague from Amnesty International, Shireen, to say something.
Thank you, Rob. Firstly, I just want to say that this call we're making today, it's a no-brainer, because at the end of the day, the UN Secretary General himself, Guterres, has said that he wants to know the truth behind what happened. Bachelet, the High Commissioner on Human Rights, also said that she would like to see a transparent probe. The US President himself, Donald Trump, said that you, the press, should stop treating Saudi Arabia as if they are guilty before being proven innocent. So if we're looking for proving Saudi Arabia's innocence, we believe that there is no other way. Our best shot at a credible investigation, at a transparent investigation, at an investigation that won't be politicized, is for the UN to conduct it, is for Turkey to make this request. There really is no other way. The second point I want to make is that this incident didn't happen in a vacuum. Jamal Khashoggi is not one case that is an anomaly. It happened within a context of an increased crackdown on dissent since June 2017, when the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman took his position. And it's part of a pattern of increased crackdown on anyone who dares to, in fact, dares even to question the narrative of what's going on in Saudi Arabia, to question what's going on in the country, to hold to account any of their leaders. And that includes clerics, it includes journalists, it includes human rights defenders. And that's why this case and the importance and what's riding on it isn't just about one man. It's not just about us. It's not about human rights defenders. It's also about all of you, which is why I guess so many people are here today, because you know the stakes, how high the stakes are right now, and what it means for all of you to have a case like this happen and for it to just be whitewashed and for us not to have a credible investigation. And the last point I want to make is really just an appeal to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, because we cannot live in a world where governments can use chemical weapons against their own citizens and nothing happens, where a military can ethnically cleanse, torture, and rape an entire community and no one is held to account, where a journalist in a major city walks into a consulate and is tortured and killed and nothing happens. This is the time for him to step up and take leadership and be bold like he should have been before, but we really need him to be now, because we are losing this war. We are losing it as human rights defenders and you are losing it as journalists, and we need him to step up. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask Lou Charbonneau, who many of you know from Human Rights Watch, to say a few words.
Thanks, Rob and Shireen, and thanks to all of you. Thanks, Rob, Shireen, and to all of you for coming, and all of you who are out there in cyberspace watching. I think that Shireen made a very good point right now about the need for UN involvement. This is what the UN was created for. This is why we need it. We need credibility. All of us have been bombarded in recent days with a bewildering blitz of information about what happened to this very important journalist. It's impossible to make any sense of it. We're getting hit every time I pick up my phone. There's a new breaking news story about yet another leak from Turkish officials saying with more grisly details about what happened. We need to take control of this and add some credibility, because it's too painful for it to be out there, and this sort of circus-like atmosphere for what seems to be a brutal and tragic occurrence, or all indications are that it was a brutal and tragic occurrence. The UN has done this before. This is not something that we're just pulling out of a hat like a rabbit. After the assassination of the former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, the government of Pakistan asked then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to set up an investigation. There were limitations on this investigation, so it's not a perfect model for what we're talking about here, but they produced some very good results. One of the things that they pointed to is a word that has been resonating on this panel already several times today. They pointed to a whitewash, an attempt by the authorities at the time to cover up what really happened. So what we're trying to do here is prevent a whitewash of the disappearance and possible murder, extrajudicial execution of Jamal Khashoggi. So we need accountability. And in order to have accountability, we need information, credible information, and an investigation. And this investigation should cover all grounds. There should be no diplomatic immunity for persons or property. Everyone should be available for interviews, and all audio, visual tapes, recordings that Turkish authorities have should be handed over to these international investigators, who should be seasoned professionals, very high caliber, people who know what they're doing and who can add some credibility to a situation which is sorely lacking that. And finally, this is not something where we're asking the Secretary General to go busting down doors. We want the Turkish government, which has unfortunately an abysmal record with the treatment of journalists on its own, as does Saudi Arabia, to step forward, to use this as an opportunity to move forward into the future, out of the past, and to do something to help bring transparency and put an end to this kind of brutal treatment of journalists, to send a message to the world that we want reporting, we want credible information, and we will protect journalists. We're going to put an end to the brutalization of journalists, government critics, dissidents, whatever you want to call them, who are out there. And thank you. Maybe we can move to questions.
Yeah, before we go to questions, let me just say I wanted to just give you a little bit of context of where this is. This is not an isolated incident. Independent and critical journalism is in a crisis globally. There are more than 260 journalists in jail around the world at the moment. That's a record. Already this year, 44 journalists have been killed, 27 of them murdered. That's a crisis. When the Secretary General took office, I and other press freedom organizations went to meet with him, and he assured us of his commitment to uphold freedom of expression and a free press around the world. Now it's time for him to act on that commitment and to make sure that this investigation is implemented. Now I'll take questions. Please tell me who you're from and who you want to answer your question. Start at the back there. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi, Frankie Ciardo from TRT World. This is for the entire panel. Do any of you believe that President Trump is complicit in engaging in a whitewash of the evidence that is available to him at this point?
Anytime that you say that when you're trying to sort of brush this under the carpet, throw it back onto the Saudi government, then in a certain sense, yes, you're opening yourself up to complicity in a whitewash. Because if in fact it's true that the most senior members of the Saudi government were behind the execution, dismemberment of Mr. Khashoggi, then we don't want the culprits investigating themselves. This is not how you run criminal investigations. So throwing it back at them is opening the door to a whitewash. That's why we're saying, let's bring it to the UN.
Thank you. Yes.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. Whoever wants to take two questions, if you don't mind. First, have you had any contact with the Turkish mission here or any Turkish authorities, and what are their views that they've expressed to you about an investigation? Because one assumes it will be much easier if they cooperate with this idea. And the second question is about the human rights record of Mohammed bin Salman. If you could expand on that further, because in the Saudi system, the king is a job for life, but the crown prince has been replaced before. So given his record, do you think he's fit for the job, or do you think the king and the royal family should look for another crown prince?
Maybe I'll take the first question. Maybe Shireen, you want to take the second question? Yes, we have reached out to the Turkish mission and twice, and we have not heard anything back yet, but we are hoping to have a conversation with them because we do think this is something we really want them to initiate.
And just to say on the record, I mean, I think it's well recorded by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, and many other human rights organizations, the abysmal record of the Crown Prince. And in barely a year and a half, when you look at the sort of damage that he's caused, both internally to the system, the jailing and of dissidents, of academics, of clerics, of women human rights defenders at the time when he's trying to look like a reformist, it really speaks for itself. To say nothing of the devastating war on Yemen that's caused the biggest humanitarian crisis. That recently it's been reported that a third of Saudi strikes hit non-military targets. That's a lot of blood on his hands.
Sherman Briceby, South African Broadcasting. So step one is to call for an investigation and then have an investigation. But what would an appropriate penalty be here if, as we suspect, this goes right to the top of the royal family? What does the international community do to the Crown Prince, for example, of Saudi Arabia? What would be appropriate?
Well, first of all, we've already talked about the need for no government to be supplying the Saudi government with weapons, given what's been going on in Yemen with the abuses and ghastly violations by the Saudi-led coalition there. So that's something that we've already been talking about. And I think that you've been getting already signals from around the world, from the private sector, of many companies and governments saying that they're very uncomfortable to be associated with business fora in Saudi Arabia. So already messages are going out there. In terms of accountability, I think we'll have to cross that bridge when and if we come to it, and I hope we do come to it. But certainly no one should be spared appropriate penalties, whether they're the Saudi crown prince or an operative carrying a bone saw. So that's simply the way it should be.
Yeah, the lady there with her hand up. I'll get to you in a minute.
Oh, thank you. Betül Yürük, Turkish news agency Anadolu. I was wondering if you consider Secretary Pompeo's visit to Riyadh as an attempt to whitewash Saudi Arabia or to swipe the issue, as you mentioned here in your statement, under the carpet. Thank you.
Well, I think we were disappointed that there wasn't something more substantive that came out of that visit. And I mean, I would like to see President Trump, for example, speak out forcefully for more information, getting the Saudis to tell us exactly what happened. I think it's important that we get that signal from the top of the U.S. government. But what we want to do here is to find one avenue into getting to the truth. You can talk about sanctions, you can talk about consequences later, but unless you know exactly what happened and who was responsible and in what measure, you can't make intelligent decisions about how that should be sanctioned. And I would call upon President Erdogan to do the right thing here. He and my organization have been at loggerheads, it'd be nice to say, over the last few years because of the press freedom record in Turkey. Now he has a chance to step up and do something affirmative for a free press. Thank you. You have a question?
Yes, thank you.
You need a microphone.
I have a strong voice. Thank you. Errol Avdovic, Publica Press. First of all, Lou, directly follow up from Frank's question. Do you believe, having in mind that you also have information and what has been written in US press and worldwide press, that White House is complicit somehow at that this poor guy, our colleague, was somehow murdered because he had discovered something that we still don't know, not that mild criticism of the Saudi government. And number two, do you all believe that since you are, the fact that you are holding this press conference at the United Nations, that United Nations is not doing well its job when it comes to these issues, and especially in regard with this affair?
Well, in terms of going back to the question of complicity, before we start throwing words like complicity around, we need the facts. And that's why we need an investigation, and we need a credible investigation. Taking a step back to pick up on something that both Rob and Shireen have mentioned, there is an atmosphere where journalists are under threat around the world. And not just journalists, but journalists are a particular target of hatred by despotic and somewhat more or less authoritarian governments, whether we're in North America or Europe or moving elsewhere around the world. This is a trend. And when you have important leaders of important countries referring to the press as enemies and openly doing it, and without any, with sort of full impunity and often getting applause from their supporters, it emboldens the worst leaders around the world. It sends them a message, well, you know what? This guy out there who's writing nasty stories about me, we can take him out, and I'm not going to take a hit. And that's a message that we need to stop sending, and that's why it is so important that we take a step forward in this case, and that Turkey asked the Secretary General to set something up so we can get to the bottom of what happened, and we can use this as a springboard to change that, because we need to change that.
Shireen will take a second.
Sure. The reason that we're here today is because we actually believe in the UN system, because we think that there's something, it's in a unique position to actually do something. So it's not that we've given up on the UN, even though we do think that it has failed human rights defenders and dissidents and us and you time and time again, but there's still a way to make good. There's still a way for them to get involved here, and that is what we're asking them to do right now. Because every time the UN system, and particularly the UN Secretary General, fails to speak up, he enables another tragedy, another person who's killed, another population that is ethnically cleansed, every single time.
And you will follow up on this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, this gentleman has been waiting, and then the lady behind him.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi, and I have two questions, in fact. Article 41 of the Convention on Consular Relations, it says that consulates are protected territory, and the consular or the officers who work there should not be prosecuted, should not be called, should not be detained. However, except in the case of grave crimes. Does this qualify as a grave crime? And once it is committed inside the consulate, does that mean the whole government behind that consulate is responsible and not individuals, even if one individual isn't identified? And my second question is about hypocrisy of Western countries. When Skripal and his daughter, Julia, they were attacked, and before investigation, Security Council was called for an emergency meeting twice. In fact, the British representative here called for immediate emergency meeting of the Security Council, and about 20 countries lowered their representation, expelled many Russian diplomats, and before the end of the investigation, before we know if the Russians did it or not. In this case, I didn't see anybody rushing to the Security Council, no statement from the Security Council, no one called for lowering the representation of Saudi Arabia. Why is that? Don't you see that a flagrant case of hypocrisy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, on the question of immunity that really we're talking about, I think that we'd be getting ahead of ourselves if we started to talk about the details. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't talk to you about how the particularities of the legal immunity and inviolability of properties goes, but we're asking the Saudi government to remove all of these things, to basically open everything up, all properties, all people, to investigation, so that this is not a problem. And then in terms of the hypocrisy of the international community and the Security Council, we are not addressing this call to the Security Council. We don't want this to be yet another thing that winds on the lap of the Security Council and ends up in a focus of interminable political wrangling, right? This is why we're saying Turkey can take this straight to the Secretary General, and it can happen fast, like that. That's how we want it to go. We don't want this to be another thing where the Security Council does nothing. And certainly the Security Council has an awful record when it comes to dealing with international crises. We won't go into that here.
Okay, thank you. The lady there.
Hi, I'm Carol Landry with Agence France Presse. So my question is, how realistically do you think it would be that Turkey would request this investigation? And secondly, aside from this possible venue of action, do you see anything else that the Secretary General could be doing on this file? Thank you.
Firstly, Carol, I feel like we sit here a lot and we speak to journalists and we often call for referrals to the International Criminal Court, and we do it on principle, and we really hope that one day something will happen, but we kind of know usually when we're standing here that we're doing it for principle reasons. Today is different. Today takes Turkey to stand up and do, what they say they want, which is to find the truth of the situation, and something that they've already started internally to do. So yes, the truth is we do think that it's possible. We're calling for it because we think that this is something that should happen, that can happen. It can happen very quickly. What it takes is will. It takes political will from Turkey, and it takes some strength from the UN Secretary General to withstand the pressure, the financial, the political pressure, and to do the right thing. And that's what we're here to ask for.
And I think just to add that governments should be sending this message to Turkey as well, to do this, that it's really something that Turkey has already initiated a criminal investigation. They say it will be at international standards. Well, this is a way of making sure that the wider investigation does meet international standards. So governments around the world should be talking to Turkey, whether it's the United States or others with influence, and saying, like, you need to do this. Invite in the international community, add some much needed credibility.
Thank you. Sorry.
Second question about other possible venues of action. Is there anything else?
Well, the SG can join in the calls for Turkey. I mean, he can do what's necessary to encourage the parties to open themselves up for this. There needs to be some persuasion work done. We're trying to do our part. You can also ask questions of Turkey, Saudi, and the Secretary General at the noon briefing. You can raise this and just get everyone starting to talk and to move quickly. It's very important to move quickly.
And there are other things outside of the UN system that can be done too. We've already had Senate Foreign Relations Committee write to the President in regards to the Global Magnitsky Act. The Senate, after the midterm elections here, could hold extraordinary hearings. There are lots of things. Pardon? Yeah. I'm saying that the two chairs of the Foreign Senate Relations Committee have already written last week to the executive to trigger, and they have 120 days to go back. I don't want to go into the details of the Global Magnitsky Act, but it's a possible way of sanctioning gross violations of human rights. So there are other things too. It's not just one thing. This is such a horrendous crime that we shouldn't just be calling on one avenue of getting justice. Okay, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle Nichols from Reuters. Just to follow up, Lou, to the remarks you were making then, but for the whole panel, and follow on to James's question. You haven't heard back from the Turkish UN mission. Is there appetite among other countries here to put pressure on Turkey to make this request?
I hope there is. I mean, it's certainly, there is a lot of support so far for this, but whether it's translating into the kind of pressure that we would like to see, we don't know yet. I mean, we came together with this appeal very quickly because we all felt very strongly. This was an idea that was hatched on Monday, and we're here on Thursday, and so we're trying to do everything we can to push this forward as quickly as possible. And but you raising questions will hopefully help do that as well. But we will continue to push member states, not just Turkey and Saudi Arabia.
Just to say that I think many member states and representatives here are in a tricky position because of the ongoing Saudi investigation that they're carrying out, and I think that they have to pay at very least lip service to, what is very possibly, very likely to be, an investigation that lacks real credibility. But what I hope that is, in the coming days when we see some of the results, or, if we see some of the results of this investigation, at least they see it, that they don't just put that in their drawer somewhere and tick a box and hope that this will go away. And it's really up to all of us to make sure that that doesn't happen, because it's very easy in these next coming days as Saudi investigates itself for us to just move on, and that really can't happen. That would be a crime.
One thing I should add that two special rapporteurs, Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression and the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, have both, they co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post a few days ago calling for an international investigation. This is the kind of thing that we're all asking for, the same thing, which is a credible investigation. We believe the best way to do it is for Turkey to invite the Secretary General to begin the process. But this is something that's out there, and it's gathering momentum, and we hope that the momentum will be such that simply Turkey will not be able to say no and will actually have to step forward and do this, and that the Saudis will be under so much pressure that they will have to cooperate.
Okay. Next question.
Thank you, Mario Villar, Agencia F. Considering the record of that Turkey has with journalists and the precedent that this could set for them, have you considered any other avenue to bring this to the Secretary General?
Well, we've already broached this with the Secretary General's office. This is something where we really feel that the first step needs to come from Turkey. And we think this is important, that in order for it to work, Turkey has to want the truth to come out. And the Turkish government has said that's the case. They say they've got a proper criminal investigation that will meet international standards underway. This is a way of ensuring that that's the case. But we are talking with everyone who needs to be involved, but this really needs to start with Turkey.
Okay. The gentleman there.
Hi, this is Amitoj Singh from NDTV, New Delhi Television Limited from India. With all that's being said, the calls for international investigation, there's a danger that there could be a cover-up story being framed or put together. Is it already too late?
No, I don't believe it's too late. I mean, I think the thing is that we need journalists to do their job. we're all of us need to get out there and start reporting on what is behind this disappearance. There are the statements from Turkish officials, which have been dripping out now for nearly 2 weeks. But I think that we can help, but we do need this official mechanism. It's not going to be too late. It can't be too late. Would we want, as journalists, one of our own to be murdered in this brutal way and we just all carry on? No, I don't think so. So there are going to be stories. We've already seen it. The Saudis are floating rogue elements. I mean, how can you have rogue elements with a bone saw in 2 jets that come from Saudi Arabia? That was good. The journalists are already doing their job. They've been tracking the people who were on that plane. We have seen pictures of those people with the Crown Prince on previous trips. This is the kind of good investigative forensic journalism that we need to get to the bottom of this, because it won't be done by the Saudis. And I'm hoping that the Turks step up and that they do initiate this investigation. That will help us as journalists in our work.
Let me make one point to throw it back at the audience here. Since this is about journalists, you all also have an interest in seeing this happen. As the weeks go on and other stories pop up, and in the kind of craziness of breaking news, we can't let them forget this and let it sort of move on as yet another story, the unsolved mystery. We need to keep the pressure on, and we will do our part, but you also need to do your part and to keep bringing it up at the UN with the governments every time you have an opportunity. This is added value that you can bring.
Yeah, I'll come back to you in a minute. There's still people who haven't had a chance to ask a question. Okay, you take that one, and then the lady near the door. Over there first.
Hi, Melissa Kent, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC. Thank you very much for holding this press conference today. I wanted to just ask you 2 questions. You've spoken about the record number of journalists being jailed around the world and that countries are feeling emboldened. But I'm wondering if you were surprised at the, I'm not sure what the word is, the brazenness of this incident. There was CCTV footage. His wife was or soon-to-be wife was waiting outside. It was very publicly known that he was going into the consulate to get these documents. And I'm wondering if you're shocked, surprised at the brazenness of this incident. And my second question is that the Washington Post published what we believe is his final column today, and it called for greater freedom of expression in the Arab world. And I'm wondering if you could sort of give an overview of what you think is happening as far as freedom of expression, freedom of the media in the Arab world.
Yeah, well, the first question, I was horrified when I saw this, and the fact that we're still more than 2 weeks out from this incident and we don't know what happened. We don't know for sure. If it did happen that he was lured deliberately inside that consulate and killed, that is really brazen. But what is that doing? That's sending a message. I don't care. This is a chilling warning to any journalists that do what Jamal was doing. This is what could happen to you, and we don't care what the international reaction would be. I don't know. Maybe it was a botched interrogation, as they say. We don't know yet. That's why we want an investigation. And the fact that today, poignantly, his last column appears in the Washington Post, what does it talk about? It talks about the shrinking space for freedom of expression and freedom of the press in the Arab world, which he cared about. Saudi Arabia has, for many years, been on the Committee to Protect Journalists' Most Censored Country list. It's number 3 behind North Korea and Eritrea. That will give you some indication of just how much independent journalism there is in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And also in the Middle East, we have seen since 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, an increasing repression of free and independent journalism in there. In 2011, there were no journalists in jail in Egypt. At the moment, there's more than 20. What does that tell you about how the government of Egypt is working? As Jamal pointed out in his column today, it's only Tunisia, the place where the Arab Spring started, that has anything like a free press. So that's what I said at the beginning of this press conference. We have to put this in a global context of we, journalists, I'm a journalist like you, we are under threat around the world. Our work is under attack from repressive governments, from militias, and from organized crime. Journalists are killed with impunity. It takes a few $1,000s to get a journalist killed in many countries, including the one next door in Mexico. So We have to fight back on this, because if we don't, that space will continue to shrink. And countries like Saudi Arabia, which have wealth and influence, will continue to suppress journalism. Anyone else want to add?
Thank you very much
Okay.
for the briefing.
Yeah.
It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You mentioned the previous example of Benazir Bhutto investigation with Ban Ki-moon. Walk us through how this would work. You're asking Turkey to ask Guterres to start an investigation. Would it be with independent investigators and forensic experts? How would it work in terms of the past, how it has worked? Thanks.
Let me ask my colleagues to answer that.
The way we see it is, yes, that Turkey would send a request immediately to the Secretary General, ask him to urgently set up an investigation team. And what we would like to see is seasoned investigators with criminal experience, people who know how to work internationally, and to include forensic experts, all kinds of things like that. Basically to get a credible team together where they can share information. Ideally, this would rise to the level where governments would agree to give them, say, powers of subpoena and things like that. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Step one is to initiate the process, and then I think we can trust that the Secretary General would be able to work out the details in the terms of reference. Certainly, we would have recommendations for how to do it, but at this point, let's get the process started.
Just to follow up, does Turkey lead it, or it's independent?
No, we're asking for this to be an independent UN investigation, and we're asking Turkey to call for it.
Out of the UN human rights, or in a particular?
No, we're asking him to ask the Secretary General to set up an investigation team. Well, again, that's something you need to ask them, but we would like them to cooperate. But since they're the prime suspects in this case, what's most important is for Turkey, since this happened in Turkey, apparently, that we need them to start this and to begin the cooperation.
I think what I would add is, this is about getting the political will to pursue justice. It's not about the mechanics of who sends what letter to whom at what time. That's important, and Lou's addressed that, but it's about the political will. And this is a moment where we have a head of steam. I have not seen such a horror and such broad international press coverage of the murder of a journalist in many, many years. There have been other prominent journalists that have been assassinated. I can think of Anna Politkovskaya in Russia, for example, which was horrific. But I have not seen this level of international coverage. Look at this room. It's full of journalists and cameras. Why? This has touched a nerve. This is touched a nerve because it is Saudi Arabia, it is the United States, and it is just one more murder of a journalist. So what I want to do as a journalist and as a press freedom defender is capitalize on that and have this message amplified so that the political will to pursue justice is driven forward. We have to take serious action on this, and the mechanics of it are fairly straightforward. The point is that we want all the countries that say they stand up for a free press to work with us and have Turkey get this investigation underway, and have the UN Secretary General stand up affirmatively for the values that he says he upholds, namely a free press. There's so many people that have asked the question. You've already asked too. No, let's just do the lady there, Edie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. One follow-up question. Is it true that it is required that a UN member state actually make a formal request to the Secretary General to launch an investigation? And would it have to be Turkey, or could it be some other country that was not directly involved? And secondly, why aren't you pursuing this also at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva?
So there are many ways that investigation could happen. It could happen at the Human Rights Council. It could be the Security Council. In theory, the Secretary General could start an investigation. In reality, it wouldn't. I don't think it would. If it was created as a kind of hostile act, or if it was to be perceived as a hostile act on the part of Turkey or others, this might make it more complicated. Yes, you can do it, and such investigations happen. What we would like is for that not to be the case. The best case scenario is for Turkey to open itself up and to invite the Secretary General to come in. We want it to happen with consent, and we want this to be a cooperative venture. Turkey has an interest in seeing that the facts of this case be determined beyond any doubt, and that they have an interest in a proper investigation. We don't want the Security Council to sort of, we're not throwing this at the Security Council because we don't want political wrangling. I think with the Human Rights Council, yes, it's a very good institution, even though it just last week elected some countries that we would rather not see on the Human Rights Council. They do very good investigative work in a number of places, in Myanmar, South Sudan, Burundi, North Korea, Syria. But this is a one-off case. We need to move quickly, and the best way to do it, in our view, is for the Secretary General to get this invitation. And I should add that all three of us on this panel here are former journalists, and this is one of the reasons why we care so much about this issue. We're with you all.
Okay, the gentleman there, and then we'll come over to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Stefano Baccara, Radio Radicale in Rome, La Voce di New York. I arrived late, so I just hope that this was not asked again. How do you trust, how you can trust Turkey that in your ranking is one of the worst at the moment country? So why you say it's the interest of Turkey? Yes, maybe Turkey has an interest to make a bad light Saudi Arabia at the moment, but the point is how you can trust Turkey to create a precedent of the UN coming to Turkey, investigating, an act against journalism. To me, it looks a little bit naive.
We're not talking about trusting Turkey here. We're talking about asking Turkey to change, to take a step forward. We're not being naive about this. We realize that this is a challenge, but there is a lot of pressure on Turkey, on Saudi Arabia, on the United States and others. And we hope that this pressure, this momentum that's coming from you, that's coming from governments, that's coming from groups like ours, will cause Turkey to move forward. We aren't in the business of trusting governments. What we want to do is to see them change and to become better.
Just to add that you make a good point about Turkey's abysmal record, especially on journalists. But this is a case whereby they themselves have been saying that they did nothing wrong in this, that this is, Saudi Arabia's doing, and all these leaks of these tapes and what's been going on. So it is in their interest to have a credible investigation. So if we're ever going to get them to move on a case like this, to do with journalists, it is at this moment. So, we hope that that's what happens.
And there are numerous cases of enforced disappearances in Turkey. This is not something that Saudi Arabia is alone with. So, but yes, it is a fair point. We're very aware of it, but we're trying to push things forward.
Absolutely, and you have to play with the cards you're dealt. You wanted to say something? You use the microphone, please.
Just to follow up, and Stefano did place a very good question. How can you you are not in the business of trusting or not trusting the government or Turkey, but still...
We're more in the business of not trusting.
Yeah, but why pushing the whole investigation and pressure even toward Turkey, when in this case, they came out with, I would say, everybody would say, even the American intelligence, credible intelligence information on what has been happened. Really don't understand a little bit mixed up with that. Why pressure toward Turkey? Why not pressure the Washington, especially the Trump administration, who is showing that he wants to protect Saudi monarchs, Saudis in this case, and so why don't push all that pressure toward Washington instead of Ankara?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say a very obvious point. What is the end game here? The end game is to uncover the truth about what happened. If you work backwards from that, well, to find out what happened to Jamal Khashoggi and the details of the case, that's the end goal here. So if you work backwards from that point, it is then you need a credible investigation, and you're never going to have an investigation that can really happen if you're not going to have the buy-in and the consent really of Turkey and to some extent Saudi Arabia. So we need that. We need Turkey to request it. And it's actually quite a linear, very simple thing that we're asking for.
And if I could just let me just answer the question. We are addressing this to the United States as well as the others. We want Turkey to initiate it, but we can't make a judgment here about whether the information that is coming out of Turkey and what the Turkish government is doing is credible, it's good. We are not in a position to determine that. We're asking for there to be an international body created by the UN that would be able to determine that. And at this point, there isn't a credible investigation, so that's why we need this.
Exactly. Sorry, you've had 5 questions.
Let's get Farnaz.
Can we do this?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, there, then Farnaz. Yeah.
Given that perhaps the United States would be, there's no better country to pressure Turkey to ask for this investigation. I'm interested how you guys think about the White House and Pompeo's rhetoric about the financial relationship with Saudi Arabia being the #1 reason why we should be hesitant to push them to investigate these types of things. It seems like there's a similarity between your rhetoric and the White House's rhetoric on this issue. You're calling out the financial relationship, they're calling out the financial relationship, and I'm interested in hearing how has that evolved over time, do you think? How is this administration treating that issue differently in terms of, saying basically straight up, we sell arms to them, that's why we won't investigate?
Thanks, guys.
I can jump in if you want.
Yeah, I'm not completely understanding the link that you're making between us our call here in the U.S. and also to say that we're up here calling for a UN investigation and calling on Turkey as the country where this allegedly happened to initiate this process. That doesn't mean that we do nothing else. Doesn't mean that we don't also pressure the US in our advocacy. It doesn't mean that we're not going out to other missions, to other member states and also asking them in public and in private to do their thing, and also within the UN system. But what we're here today to do is to ask Turkey, because it is the easiest, the fastest, and honestly the most logical step, and a step that they can take literally today that would initiate a process that could lead to the truth.
And the importance of Saudi-U.S. economic ties, this is nothing new. Perhaps it's a bit, what maybe is new to us is the brutal honesty with which they present the economic interests and how important it is. Perhaps previous administrations, which, let's face it, had a similar approach, might have been a little less willing to just say, yeah, it's really all about money. We aren't going to stop there, and that's not a satisfactory answer. And the fact that there's so much pressure, and the U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia are being pressured for reasons that are not linked to these economic ties that they have around the world, shows that there's something else at work here. The outrage, the revulsion, the disgust about this murder, this brazen, this potential murder, since we're still waiting to find out if that's exactly what happened, that it's as if it's the straw that broke the camel's back, and that something needs to change. We hope something can change.
Okay, the lady in red there, and then then you over there. Oh, okay. Whoever's got the mic. Sorry. Yeah.
Celia Davaren from Mediapart. You were talking earlier about political will, but let's say when it comes to my country, France, and we talk of economic interest, we did not hear the country of human rights at all on that disappearance. What does it say?
I mean, yeah, there are a lot of countries that are that are selling weapons to the Saudis, right? France among them. We had the case of Germany, which in the coalition agreement they had promised to not. They had banned the sale of arms to the coalition, the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. But in fact, they're going back on that, which is very disappointing. They're not the only ones. So all these governments should be called out, and we should keep our eye on the wider level of abuses, as both Rob and Shireen have said. The case of Jamal Khashoggi did not come out of the blue. It is not in a vacuum. It is not an isolated thing. It's just, as I said, perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two questions. Do you think that the government of Turkey is leveraging Jamal's murder for political and economic gains in some sort of a deal with Saudi and the US? Because they've been leaking the results of their investigation, but the government hasn't actually been transparent about what it has. Second question to Robert. Have you been hearing about from exiled journalists or dissidents about their fears of stepping into their home consulates or embassies, and what is your advice to them?
Okay, I'll take the second question first. I have not heard from any particular journalists or group of journalists about going into their consulates. My advice to them is the same as any journalist. You do a risk assessment, right? And to make sure that if you are going to go into a dangerous place, I can't even believe I'm saying this, that a diplomatic mission should be regarded as a dangerous place. Do you realize how absurd that sounds to me? But tell people what you're doing, let it be known, make sure that it's public, that you're entering it. That's all you can do. And the first question, I don't know what the motivation behind the Turks is. I'd like to know what actually happened. We have had senior AK party officials and others around Erdogan leaking information to journalists, and it's been done in a fashion which is not satisfactory, in that we would like to know, and I'm sure his family would like to know, what has happened to Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, that's just so cruel when you think about it, that someone's relative, fiance, brother, is in a situation where you don't know whether he's alive or dead. So if the Turks are leveraging this, I would ask them to stop, and I would ask them to do the right thing, which is to send that letter today to Guterres and start this process.
And I think that the last thing that we want to see is there to be some sort of deal or payoff at a high-level exchange between governments to say, okay, we're satisfied, we've figured things out. This is not what we want, and we hopefully this will not happen. So as Rob said, it's difficult. We don't know what the calculations are there, but it is, as I said, this bewildering blitz of information coming out of the media, the leaks. We need to get a grip on this and have a credible investigation and know what actually happened.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. Let's take the last couple of questions. All right, Yusuf.
I already asked.
Can you take the microphone, please?
Well, as a journalist, I know that you are also a journalist. What do you do of this? Because somebody told me, on these days when we are so interested on this subject, say, what about when Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen and killed children and all this going on? And there was not so many out there stories. There was, but not so much attention from journalists. I've been from friends accused of being, hey, you are doing all this fuss about it when he's a journalist. So your organizations, what do they say about that?
I mean, I think what this case does really, and this has been brought up again and again in the last hour, all it does is expose and bring to the surface something that we already know, which is the abysmal record of Saudi Arabia and the fact that member states, even those who profess to be human rights friendly, are very hypocritical when it comes to the subject of Saudi Arabia and shielding their main ally, whether it's at the Security Council or elsewhere. So there are no big surprises here, and we can see this as a moment to stop and say enough, or we can say this is just another incident. Let's deal with it and move on. And that choice is for us all here today.
Any more questions? Okay, great. This reminds me to thank you all for coming out. Thank you for your interest in this. To thank UNCA again for hosting us. And I hope that we see some positive results as a result of this press conference. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, reach out to our partners at Reporters Without Borders, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. They've got a lot to add.